All men are not created equal, he declares, tall, imperious, and eagle of a man. The weak have deceived you. They would say the meek should inherit the earth, that the strong should nurture the gentle. This is the noble lie of democracy, the cancer that poisoned mankind. My name is Sean Hiller. Welcome to Lectio, where we read and review books through the lens of the church. And today we are reading my most recently finished book, Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is the spoiler-free review version of this book, so don't worry, we're not going to spill any beans. We are going to foreshadow heavily. So hopefully that's what you want, and we're going to give you everything you need to know about this book. If you need to read it, if it's good for you to read, if your kids can read it, all the above. Let's get into it. Red Rising by Pierce Brown is a gritty, high-stakes science fiction fantasy novel written for young adults set on colonized Mars, but not the Mars we know. Society is divided into a strict hierarchy of colors, each genetically engineered and conditioned for a specific role. At the bottom of the pyramid are the Reds, who mine the planet's surface, believing they are building a better future for all. The story follows Darrow, a Red who discovers that everything he's been told is a lie. The world above isn't struggling, it's thriving, and its people are nothing more than expendable labor. Fueled by grief and rage, Darrow is recruited by a rebel group to infiltrate the elite ruling class. But to do so, he must become one of them, a Gold. What follows is a brutal, pulse-pounding journey through deception, transformation, and rebellion as Darrow enters a deadly academy designed to train the next generation of leaders and learns just how far he'll have to go to spark a revolution. I really enjoyed reading the first book of the Red Rising series. I'm going to give you my full summary of it at the end. Again, this is spoiler-free, but before we get to that summary, let's dive into what actually makes this book tick. Guys, I hope you're enjoying our review. Please, if you have not already, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell. We try to bring you so many different book reviews, so many different philosophical discussions on books through the lens of the church. If that means something to you, please support us, like the video, share it, and spread the word. Thanks. From the very beginning, and maybe the most important question if we're reading things through the lens of the church, we have to ask, what religion is this book supporting, or what religion is the author of this book? And we had to do some digging, but we found out that Pierce Brown himself, he's acclaimed a-religious. We don't know if that's atheist, we don't know if that's agnostic, but he states that he's a-religious. We had to dive deep into a Reddit feed, and we found a conversation that he was having with his fans. And in that conversation, a fan asked him the question, what compelled you to put the tidbits of the Veil and Darrow's faith into the series? So the Veil is the place where the lowborns, the place where the lowest level of society, the Reds, believe that they go after they die. We don't get much more than that from the first book, at least. I don't know about the other books. I haven't read those yet. Coming. That's where he talks about the lowest level of society going after they died. When you go up to the highest end, the Golds, they don't talk about religion whatsoever. They almost ignore eternity, and they don't think about death really beyond how they live in that moment. So there's a big contrast there, but the only real religious tone as far as a pure religion that he talks about is this place called the Veil for the Reds. Continuing on with the question, I've noticed that you've used Darrow's faith as a way for him to cope and pull power when in times of need. He also loses his faith and disbelieves in it after going through severe trauma. Does this perhaps reflect your own experience, or is this dynamic something you were just intrigued about? So he asked him the question, and this is Pierce's response. Pierce responded with, it's just a dynamic I'm intrigued with. I have no religion now, but I have before, though I don't know if I believed it or if it was just a social construct and I did what everyone else was doing. I've seen how religion ebbs in times of surety and flows in times of strain. I bet a lot of people are that way. I'm sure my perspective will change when I have a kid or two and then when they have kids. So that's Pierce Brown's response to this. Christianity, the church, flourishes in times of trial and in time of struggle. Look, Christ was crucified and then Christianity exploded at magnitudes that no other religion has ever seen. And it was times when the church itself was being persecuted was when the church actually grew, when people came to know our Lord Jesus Christ more and more and more. And famously, as Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So the more the church struggled, the more seeds are planted. Let's go back into it. So even though he's painting this picture of a book that is a-religious, after reading this book, I cannot say that this book is atheist. I say that this book has religious overtones all through it, whether he consciously put those in there or not, or subconsciously. There was a few times when the main character's wife, Darrow's wife, actually suggests that the traits that he has, the characteristics that he has, were gifts that were given to him. That is not an atheistic statement. That is a statement saying there is some God, there is some deity that has bestowed these traits and gifts upon this character. So far in that book 1, whoever the giver of this gift is has not been addressed. I don't know if it will ever be addressed. Next question, when you're trying to figure out what to read a book, you should ask, is there truth in this book? Is this just a vapid book that's really shallow and you're just reading it to kind of feel good about yourself? Or is this actual truth? Is there God's truth in this book? That really means that reality is present in this book. We have this bad habit of saying that reality isn't things that are religious, when I would argue historically all of mankind would argue that reality is religion, particularly religion of Christianity, because that is where we tap into the truth about reality. That's when we tap into the realest of real things of all, God becoming man, dying for us, and then ascending back into heaven. That is as real as it gets. And there's some of these overtones in this book. The reality that we have from God is really the moral code that's in our hearts. And it's also how we interact with the world and how we have consequences for our actions, whether good actions or bad actions. So many authors try to create their own version of reality, whereas something happens and there's not the appropriate consequence for whatever they did. Whereas Pierce Brown stays true to reality. And a character has an action and they receive an appropriate consequence from that action. He doesn't veer from that. He's very real with that. Many authors have gotten away from that. So let's get into the language he uses in the books, particularly on the vulgarity of the language. I think the book is very much written for young adults. I've seen many where it's written for ages 15 plus, but many kids at the age of 12 and 13 are reading these books. So as I'm reviewing this book and talking about it, I'm thinking about, is it also appropriate for a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, a 14-year-old? I'm trying to think through that. So from a language perspective, the language overall in the book is mild to moderate. I wouldn't say it's atrocious, but it's not fully clean. The most common swear word that is used in all of the book is bloody damn or gory damn. Those are used specifically if Darrow is referring to his red self or in his gold stature. When he's speaking to people, he might use one or the other. That's pretty mild. But, and this is where I dock the most points for this series on the language side, is that he does use our Lord's name in vain 3 times in the book. GD, using the word's name in vain, that's something you really have to take into account when you're deciding who is this book appropriate for from a reader's perspective. This is never something I'm thrilled to see in any book, and it's always something to consider when you're thinking about reading a book, but also for your kids or other kids you may recommend this book to. I am going to continue to read this series and prayerfully maintain that discipline, that it is never okay to use that phrase. It is not. And on the other hand, I'm also 33 and I have the ability to discern this. And I lean toward the side on a lot of things, not everything, for sure, not everything. You can look at the review that I made of another book over here called Akatar. We can talk about that. I lean on the side of it being okay with us to read things as long as we have the discernment and the knowledge to be able to separate that from what is reality. And reality is, how can I worship God and how can I worship God with my body, soul, and mind? That should always come to the forefront when deciding what to read, what to watch, what to do in your life in general. Would the language in this book deter me from allowing my kids to read this book? Yes, this is not a book that I'm going to have on my bottom shelf of my bookshelf that my kids can reach before I'm going to allow them to read it. This is going to be a book that I have somewhere else where they can just grab it and read, specifically because I'd be fearful that they would read some of these words that take our Lord's name in vain. That is not something I want any child to read, specifically one that's trying to figure out how the world works. I don't want them to be influenced by that. Maybe when I start to learn my kids start to learn more and I'm able to see, okay, they're able to discern between right and wrong, between good and bad. They're able to hold their own against what the world is trying to push on them. This is a very nuanced conversation. It's something that you should take very seriously with any individual. Overall in language, I give it a 75 out of 100. It gets a C. I've seen much, much worse, but I've also seen much cleaner and much better. And particularly for the age group that this book's trying to reach, like I said, 15-ish year olds, give or take a few years. I don't like any kids seeing the Lord's name taken in vain. There's some other things that we're going to get to when we get to sexual content. For sexual content, I was pleasantly surprised at the sexual content in this book. That sounds kind of funny to say, but in the midst of the modern fantasy world that we're in, sexual content, romantasy seems to be running rapid, and it is becoming more and more graphic. And for some reason, well, we know the reason, it's a fallen world, but people magnetize to those graphic romantasies. So this book does a really good job of staying clean. In fact, really the only sexual content in the book, and this is book 1, I haven't read the other books, but through book 1 is you have a husband and a wife, and at one point the husband runs At one point, the husband runs his hand up his wife's leg. This isn't super descriptive. It's put in there. It's showing they're trying to have an intimate moment. That can evoke a little bit of a thought, but it's really mild in how it's written, so I'm not concerned with that. There's even a scene where they talk about the husband and wife making love, and they call it making love. There are no descriptives. There are nothing else to go with it. There is no graphic imagery involved. It simply says, "And I drink the sounds, the smells, the sight as my wife and I make love in a bed of grass beneath a roof of stars." In my world, I'm fine with that. A husband and a wife make love. And again, you have to take into account your kids or you and your particular situation, but I'm fine with that. That's very clean to me. Where this book loses the most points on sexual content is how it approaches self-mutilation, otherwise known as masturbation. I think this is the case where they speak, one guy says it to another, and he says it in a way that is derogatory for sure. It's a joke, and I don't get down with that. It's something that if my 8-year-old read, I'd be like, oh no, I don't want them reading this. I don't want them to think about it. I don't want them to know what that is, okay? They're going to learn it eventually in life, but I want to protect them from that as long as possible. So that docked major points for me. Again, if there's 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds reading this book, I'm going to think about all this before I recommend a book. So for sexual content, I give this book an 85 out of 100. It gets a B, and I stand by that B. Without those few scenes, really one scene, maybe two, without those two scenes, I would give this book a 95. I think sexual content is great, but those two scenes drop it several points. Let's talk about violence. This is a violent book. There are some grotesque imagery. There is some true butchery in this book from human to human. I will say this with a disclaimer. I do weigh violence in books far less than I weigh language and sexual content. I think language and sexual content are going to be things that infiltrate us far more than the brutality in books. And I think we can't get around brutality. And this is something I've thought about much. Even when you tell about the lives of the saints or the lives of the martyrs, many of these martyrs were brutalized upon their death. St. Lawrence was literally griddled. He was grilled alive. And famously at one point, he looks up at his torturers and he says, "Hey, I think you can flip me over. I'm dead on this side." I don't know if he actually said that. That's amazing if he did. But that's a pretty grotesque and brutal way to describe something. So I weigh these things far less. If the brutality goes into the sexual realm where characters are being degraded in a very physical, brutally way, and it's sexually explicit, then I'm going to drop it major points on both the violence and the sexual content phase. But this book doesn't do that. But it is violent. And for the sheer fact that it is violent, and we're talking to a young audience, I give this book a 60 out of 100 on violence. It's a D minus. But it doesn't bring the overall score down as much as you would think because I weigh violence differently. Substance abuse, this is an area that we have to talk about. Again, it's young adults, so we have to talk about it. There are several allusions to drug abuse in this book, but none of the drug abuse allusions are heavy. In fact, most of them revolve around they wear this armor and the person gets hurt and the armor automatically injects painkillers into them. That's fine. That's medical talk. There are a few times when the characters are drinking alcohol heavily, and these are all the characters in the book when it gets to these scenes are 17, 18 years old. They're kids, and there's talking about them really partying. They're partying, they're drinking alcohol, and it's showing that in a very favorable light, almost like you would paint scenes when war heroes come home and they drink in celebration when they come home. So you can take that for what it is. But if you're a kid reading this book, would you take that and be like, man, this is so fantastic. I would love to go drink with my buddies. Maybe. So that's going to drop at books because of how influential young adults are. So for substance abuse, I give this book a 70 out of 100. It gets a C minus. Overall, I really enjoy reading this book, and I plan to continue to read the series as they come out. This is the first book of a 3-part series. There's 3 books after the first trilogy, and I believe he's working on another trilogy. I hope they stay in the same vein. I hope it doesn't get any more explicit than it already is. I really hope he stays away from the sexual content. I don't know. I'm going to keep reading to find out, and I'm going to let you know when I do. But this book is very good. You're thrown into this world where mankind has evolved into a negative way, and largely this world that you're dropped into is a communist world. There's true social classes throughout, and you see this communist society when you have these ultra rich and ultra powerful people at the top. You see that conflict with democracy, and in the book they call it democracy with K. But those things conflict, and they're always weighing against each other. And the main character, Darrow, is kind of fighting a little bit for democracy, but it's interesting how Darrow is painted. You're getting to see both of those philosophical ideas conflict. This book touches on deeper things, and I think that's something that a lot of books nowadays are losing. We don't dive into the things that we can't quite understand. And this book is not afraid to. Pierce Brown has not been afraid to dive into some of those topics that you can't touch, the mystery. He makes you explore that. So the overall vulgarity score of the book, if you're thinking about if you should read this or if someone else should read this, I give this book a C-. I give it a 70 out of 100 on vulgarity, mainly because of the sexual content and the language and a little bit of the substance abuse, but mainly sexual content and language. I weigh those more heavily than anyone else. This is a young adult novel. We need to remind ourselves what young adult means. That could be 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds. So we need to think about that when we're recommending books to people. I give the story of the book, and overall, I give it an 87. This is a very good story in this book. I hope the rest of the series stays true to what he's writing so far. But this is a good book. If you've met all the criteria we think about and you think you can discern some of the things that we've talked about, I highly recommend you pick up a copy. You will not regret reading